Welcome everybody. I think everyone's in or otherwise is coming in. Welcome to the seminar series of the Hague Program for International Cybersecurity. Those of you who have been following that know that we have slightly shifted as of January 1st from being the Hague Program for Cyber Norms into being the Hague Program for International Cybersecurity. That means we got an extension on the work we did, but we also wanted to change the lookout and context of what we're doing a little bit. So we'll still be focusing on norms also, but the main focus of what we will be doing is international cybersecurity, looking at cyber conflict beneath the threshold, looking at emerging technologies, and also looking at the international governance thereof. So looking at international law, looking at norms, strategy, diplomacy. As before, with the program on the Hague Cyber Norms, we have two main legs to stand on. One is the academic work we do. So we do our own research, we do academic conferences and workshops, we organize our own, we speak at those of others. And we have a visiting fellowship program, which at the moment is in stasis, I should say, because we can't fly people over and have them actually work with us. We're hoping to restart that soon. The other branch we're doing is the think tank part of what we do. We do workshops, we do events open to the general public, like the seminar we're doing today. And we try to bring different communities together, a policy community, technical community, academic community, to see if we can sort of make strides in our understanding of cyberspace. And combined, the idea is that we make The Hague, Leiden University, into a hub for analytical thinking on cyberspace. I'm going to do a tiny bit of promotion for an event we're doing next year before I shift to James, who is very eager to go. I can see that. But next month we have an online roundtable called Cybersecurity and the Politics of Knowledge Production, with sort of a basic research question is, okay, how can we produce diverse and relevant knowledge in and about cybersecurity? Which is organized by Fabio Cristiano of our own program and Ximena Korowska of Central European University. A few of the people joining will be Tim Stevens from King's College in London and Miriam Dankavelty of ETH Zurich, and that brings us right back here, James Shires of Leiden University, who will also be joining that seminar, but is also the main dish for today. So James is going to talk about his book, The Politics of Cybersecurity in the Middle East, focusing especially on Egypt and the GCC states. I had to look it up. It's the Gulf Cooperation Council states, but hey, there you go. The original plan was to have Maartje Peters, who is the head of the international cyber policy of the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as a first discussant to sort of give her first ideas. Unfortunately, she has fallen ill, so yeah, beterschap to you, Maartje. But we will struggle through without her. What James and I have talked about is James will give an introduction of about 30 minutes, sort of talking us through his book and the main points, so we know what it is he's been talking about. Then I'll open the floor for people who want to ask questions. You can use the hands up function, or otherwise you can put in the chat that you want to ask a question. Just put in Q or question. It doesn't matter. Maybe that's not a bad idea to use the chat function for that. Then I know in which order the questions come in. And then we'll have a discussion. I think we'll take about an hour for this. On the other hand, if we're in the middle of a raging debate at the point of an hour, then I'll happily extend for a little bit. But for now, let's first hear from James. James, the floor is yours.
Dennis, thank you very much. Thank you very much for organizing this event. It's a pleasure to be the first speaker on the seminar series for the renamed Hague Program on International Cybersecurity. Having been a fellow of the Hague Program for Cyber Norms, I'm looking forward to seeing how it expands and develops over the next few years. I'm going to be talking, as Dennis said, for the next half an hour or so about my new book, which is now out, I think, in all good bookshops and presumably some bad, evil ones that sell everywhere and are run by someone who's just been to space as well. So it is available in the real world and online, quite appropriately. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the main argument of the book, then I'll delve into one of the chapters in a little bit more detail. It's a real pleasure to be presenting this work to you all today. It's come from what was originally a PhD doctoral proposal going back about 8 years now, and now developing into what you see before you. As you can imagine, when I first proposed the politics of cybersecurity in the Middle East 8 years ago, people thought this was a bit niche. People thought, well, okay, so it's not Russia, it's not China. What are you really hoping to get out of this, right? This is never going to be one of those things that is on the news cycles day in, day out. For better or for worse, that is exactly what has happened. And now I'm sure most of you will have seen elements of the politics of cybersecurity in the Middle East appearing over the last year, from the Pegasus papers to Iranian and Israeli cyber conflict, very regularly. This is not something that I welcome, but it is something that means that I hope the argument of the book is highly relevant, not only to academic debates on international security and cybersecurity, but also very much to policy making and the practice of politics as well. So I'm going to start just by giving a few vignettes, some ideas of the puzzle that really motivated the book. Right? Why did I get into this in the first place? Why and how did this subject appear as one of academic and personal interest? Now, the first way of thinking about the politics of cybersecurity in the Middle East we can talk about is through a few different events that happened very close together in and around the summer of 2012, right? This is a kind of time I'm thinking about what's going on and what am I studying, what am I developing as an academic proposal. And one of these was what is now known as a very famous cyber attack on the Saudi state oil company, Saudi Aramco, in August 2012, also called Shamoon and attributed to Iran. This cyber attack wiped data on thousands of computers, disrupting operations and causing Saudi Aramco to replace large parts of its business network. This was seen as a wake-up call for cybersecurity in the Middle East. It was seen as a new kind of cyber conflict, especially once the US and Israel attributed Stuxnet had been revealed a couple of years earlier. But at the same time, a few weeks before the Saudi Aramco attack in August 2012, there was a report by a group called Citizen Lab, an NGO, on spyware, on governments buying and developing surveillance tools that would intrude into devices of journalists, activists, and political opposition, and would enable to track them and even arrest and detain them. And this, again, had come out from a slightly longer trajectory, right? These nations, the Middle East overall, had emerged from what's now known as the Arab Spring protests and revolutions at the end of 2010 and start of 2011. And at that point, this is where you really saw conversations around digital surveillance coming into the mainstream media and on the minds of activists in the region. This picture you can see are people from the Egyptian protests in Cairo, from Tahrir Square, going through the archives of state security investigations. And one of the documents they found were contracts with European surveillance companies to test and to deploy targeted surveillance in Egypt. These contracts developed and definitely did not go away after the protests dissipated. At the same time, again, in August 2012, you have the development of different cybercrime laws, right? And this is, again, another kind of development that happened very much at the same time. So in this case, the one you see here is the UAE law, where they revamped, they strengthened an existing cybercrime law, but other states in the region also adopted new laws on combating cybercrimes. Many of these laws were not addressing what we might think of as cybercrimes, issues of ransomware, of identity theft, or of fraud online, but instead of content crimes, right? Trying to ensure that what was said or what was shared on social media and on websites was not politically damaging to the reputation of key individuals or the regime as a whole. And then finally, what you saw, again, developing from the Arab Spring, was a real growth in the use of the online sphere for manipulation. Developer of everything from bot armies and trolls and influence campaigns by many states in the region. And as you can see from this graph from a great Oxford Institute I worked closely with, elsewhere in the world as well. And the reason I show these 4 different vignettes, drawn from almost roughly the same time, is that they all relate to cybersecurity. Right? They all are clearly part of this issue area we're dealing with, that is cybersecurity. But other than that, they have very little in common. The Saudi Aramco attack is an interstate event, right? It's a intrusion into a massive organization that is almost on the threshold of what people would never call cyber war. Right? You have targeted surveillance, again, intrusion, hacking into devices, but for very different purposes. And then on the other side, you have far more issues around what is shared, the content of what is online, and whether we can trust it, whether it can be used to influence and manipulate, rather than the systems, rather than breaking into online or cyber systems. So they're all cybersecurity, but they pretty much don't fit together, right? They have no common ground, no shared thread. And so that led me to what was a pretty basic research question. Given that we know these are all cybersecurity, but they don't really fit together, what is the nature of cybersecurity in the Middle East? And as Dennis said, we do have to narrow the scope of the inquiry somewhat. I focused on Egypt and the Gulf states, right? The states of the Gulf Cooperation Council. And the reason I did so was partly because these states were well known to be the most advanced in cybersecurity in the region, right? Especially the richer Gulf states had invested heavily, but they also represented almost a new definition of what the Middle East was for cybersecurity. And this was a time in which many Middle East cybersecurity conferences were happening. Many commercial companies had a Middle East branch that was very much focused on selling and working in these Gulf states and in Egypt. The rest of the Middle East was either partitioned off or dealt with separately, and Israel, especially Israel, which is a story maybe for another time. And so I focus in the book on the Gulf states and Egypt. The last thing to say is that they are very contrasting states as well, right? We can see Egypt as a highly populous military bureaucracy. You can see the Gulf states as dynastic royal political systems. So they have very different state characteristics and political systems. One of the things that actually draws them together is this shared approach to cybersecurity and the shared contours of cybersecurity that I'll talk about in the next few minutes. But getting on to the argument of the book, and I say, well, we see these different forms of cybersecurity in the Middle East, and these are a result of multiple reinterpretations, right? People seeing cybersecurity, seeing the label and set of discourses and practices around it, and taking that in different directions. So the question then is, why and how would they do that? And I use a concept that I introduce extensively in the book. I'll give you a flavor of it here, which is the concept of moral maneuvers. Right? And this is how I try and capture these multiple reinterpretations of cybersecurity in the Middle East. Defined shortly, it's the alteration of both value-based and technological claims within an expert field. So in this case, cybersecurity, crucially for strategic gain. Right? So these are not philosophical arguments. They're not normative arguments for the good of the people. These reinterpretations are strategic. Right? People are doing it for their own ends. And I say, well, this is a concept that I apply to cybersecurity in the Middle East, but it's one that could be thought about more broadly. And so it has a couple of scope conditions. One is that an issue must be prominent, right? So for moral maneuvers to really occur, you're looking for an issue that is attracting significant attention and resources. For those of you with a slightly Bourdieusian bent, this might be high levels of symbolic capital. Right? Cybersecurity, of course, definitely by now, but even then, meets these criteria, being one of the top threats faced by states and organizations and even individuals around the world. But it should also be esoteric, right? And when I say esoteric, I mean that many people, the layperson, may not necessarily understand the details behind the headlines, right? Understanding how cybersecurity events, hacks, and campaigns unfold requires extensive technical expertise and as well as practical technological skill, right? It is not an uncontested area. It's not something that is immediately available to everyone. The consequence is that there's a relatively small group of people, you might call experts, we could quibble with that label, who are able to conduct this reinterpretation, who have a privileged position in saying, yes, this is how cybersecurity, this is what we should focus on, these are the threats we should be worried about. The concept of moral maneuvers also has limits, right? And in the book, I look in detail at the limits to these reinterpretations, right? So these experts saying, let's take cybersecurity in this direction, they get resistance both from other experts and the technologies themselves, right? These are people working with technologies. But it's very hard to describe these in the abstract, right? We don't want to think about binary ideas of success and failure, and so I do so in specific contexts throughout the book. And there are three main theoretical conversations I seek to connect this book to, and I want to contribute to in the book. The first are debates in comparative politics and political science on what is widely known as digital authoritarianism. Right? It's also known as resilient authoritarianism, updated or revamped authoritarianism, coming out of the Arab Spring, right? The surprising staying power for many of the regimes that people thought were ready to fall, but also more widely a rolling back of democracy and a sort of resurgence in authoritarian forms of political systems. And so to that broader conversation, I say, well, how is cybersecurity, a set of labels, practices, and technologies used to justify or resist information controls within a broader set of authoritarian practices? The second theoretical conversation here is one that is probably dear to the heart of many attending this seminar on cyber norms. And cyber norms, obviously, for those who have been in the game a while, denote the struggle between different camps worldwide to try and agree rules of the road in cyberspace. Right? What are the kinds of responsible state behavior and even non-state behavior that we should expect in cyberspace and regarding cyber operations, especially? And often the Middle East is quite absent from these discussions. Right? Yes, some states do participate in UN fora. This might be Iran or Syria, especially vocal, but definitely the Gulf states and Egypt to a certain extent, although this has changed quite recently, are relatively silent. They might participate, they might give a few pro forma remarks, but that's it. And so there's a gap there, understanding how Middle East states adopt or crucially adapt cyber norms to their own political context. And then finally, for the IR folks among you, this does speak to IR theory in general, right? Beyond cybersecurity, I argue that my account of moral maneuvers gives us a new understanding of how global issues, especially those around security and cybersecurity specifically, emerge and evolve, right? So this is not the start of cybersecurity in international politics, that you'd have to go much further back for that, but it's an account of how they emerge and evolve, how they grow, split, and fissure once they are on the international scene. So those are the theoretical conversations. Just to give you a highlight of how the book is organized, I do divide the substantive chapters into what I see as 4 forms of cybersecurity in the Middle East. This follows a more historical tracing of the development of cybersecurity and a cybersecurity expertise in the Gulf states and Egypt. And I divide the 4 forms slightly schematically according to a 2x2. That's because I did a PhD in IR, and even though it's terrible, it's very hard to get away from it. The 2x2 that I'll use today is a division between intrusion and influence on one hand, so whether cybersecurity is about hacking, unauthorized, illegitimate access to networks, or about influence on social media and online content more broadly. And then a slightly schematic distinction between whether this mainly happens at an interstate or a domestic level. And that gives me the 4 forms of cybersecurity, the 4 subjects of the different chapters of the book. If we're thinking about intrusion at an interstate level, that is cyber conflict. And I talk mainly about the development of the Iranian threat to the Gulf states in cyberspace in that chapter. The second chapter looks at intrusion, again, unauthorized access, but at a domestic level within states, right? And this is a question of the use of spyware, such as NSO groups, Pegasus system to target activists or dissidents and violate human rights on what we now know to be quite a massive scale. Turning to influence, again, at a domestic level, these are information controls, right? Seeing cybersecurity as the development of national information controls. I won't talk more about that because I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. And then finally, if we think about influence at an interstate level, we'd be looking more at foreign interference, right? Influence campaigns, disinformation campaigns happening across borders, especially in the Gulf. This takes place after the Gulf crisis between Qatar and the other GCC states, or the quartet, right? Crucially, not Kuwait and Oman were omitted. And this is where you really see new forms of foreign interference emerge that we hadn't seen elsewhere in international politics. So I'm just going to check the time now and see what we've got, and then I'll keep going. So I'm going to talk more about the information controls today rather than the other chapters, and let's get into a little more detail there. And so when we talk about information controls, we can start with a legal approach. We can look at what happened with cybercrime laws, right? And this is where I developed the concept of moral maneuvers in this context. Of course, cybercrime is a English term. It doesn't necessarily have the same equivalence in Arabic. You can see there's a few different terms that are used in these both legal documents and more widely. Cyber, or the sort of the loan word Cibrani, is becoming more common, but definitely in the early years of the 2010s was not as common. And so already there's a little bit of slippage there in terminology. But what you see is, as I gave an outline earlier, there was a real growth in the adoption of cybercrime laws after the Arab Spring, and actually before the Gulf crisis as well. Interestingly, if you look at the graph there, Egypt is a little bit later. In the book, I talk in detail about the kinds of contests that went on over the cybercrime law in Egypt that meant it was highly delayed, right? It had been drafted for at least 4 or 5 years, went through 3 or 4 different drafts, went through a lot of discussion among parliamentarians and things before it finally was adopted. The other thing I would point you to in that graph is the international element. So the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime was signed in 2001, and the Arab Convention, which technically drew on the Budapest Convention, was signed in 2010, just before the Arab Spring. Now, the Budapest Convention takes a much more, I guess, traditional approach to cybercrime, looking at questions of fraud and misuse of technologies. The Arab Convention adds to this, adding content crimes to the idea of cybercrime. And this is the kind of cybercrime that is then adopted throughout the region in these later laws, and especially it's the one that is focused on penalties are increased, sort of detention, imprisonment terms are increased for content crimes in later laws. And so this is not a necessarily a rival idea to the Budapest Convention. What I argue in the book and in some other works is that actually this is an adaptation, right? The Budapest Convention does influence the direct people who drafted these cybercrime laws, the cyber security experts who advised governments on what they should say. but it was added to, right? It was changed, it was adapted. So it's not like they weren't paying attention to the nascent cyber norm of the Budapest Convention, but they were changing it to protect their own political stability. And this is a very relevant conversation for what we see now as the potential for a new cybercrime treaty going on in the international sphere. So that's where cybercrime exists from a legislative point of view. Of course, thinking about digital authoritarianism more broadly, this is not the only kind of law that enables authoritarian practices in a cyber or digital moment. You have a lot of other laws on protest, on media laws, even some specifically fake news laws as well, adopted afterwards. But cybercrime laws are a key part of this legislative apparatus. Looking behind it means, because there are quite a few maybe policy or other analyses of cybercrime laws, then the chapter goes on to say, well, if we really want to understand the moral maneuvers, we have to look beyond the legislation and look at bureaucratic competition as well, right? Why were particular versions of cybersecurity proposed or adopted in these Gulf states? And so what I do is I trace the development of different cybersecurity institutions in these countries, and I show how from a starting point, which is largely based in telecoms regulation. So you have telecoms regulatory agencies, you have IT authorities, things like that. Eventually, cybersecurity becomes co-opted by ministries of interior, by security agencies, intelligence agencies, who increasingly stamp their authority on cybersecurity as an issue area. Right? So the telecoms functions, which were initially paramount, then become superseded by the traditional security institutions of state. And you see in the biggest column here that this emerges eventually in the construction of national cybersecurity organizations that are primarily based within or connected to these more weighty security institutions. In the book, I trace in more detail 4 of these stories: Oman, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. The Omani one is interesting because they're also a center for the Arab region cybersecurity center with the ITU, but I won't talk more about that now. If we look in a more detail at the others, you can see especially to start with President Sisi on the right of the picture, after his rise to power in 2013 and an assumption of the presidency in 2014, there is a Supreme Council of Cybersecurity. It's not seen as doing very much traditionally in sort of traditional cybersecurity terms. Large ransomware attacks happen, big data leaks happen, and it's kind of frozen. But what it does do is work to publish lists of websites that cannot be accessed to, and it brings on members from the security institutions, from the military, from the security services, and the Ministry of Interior. And so here you do really see a clear co-option as the Sisi presidency develops. And this is in line with a broader increase in censorship online in Egypt over the period from 2014 onwards. On the Saudi side, so we have the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman on the left of the picture. Once he really comes to power, becomes the de facto ruler, day-to-day ruler, what you see is proliferation of different cybersecurity entities, some under close connections. The now notorious Saud al-Qahtani was running federations for cybersecurity, various other cybersecurity NGOs in Saudi Arabia, and you have a real diminishing of the previously very powerful Ministry of Interior under Mohammed bin Naif. And here, instead of the Ministry of Interior growing in power as it does in some other states, what happens is again a centralization, again a co-option of cybersecurity, but towards the personal connections and the particular sphere of the new Crown Prince. From an Emirati perspective, this is another really fascinating story. I won't go into it in too much detail, but you have the National Electronic Security Authority being seen as a sort of one-stop shop for cybersecurity, really drawing on intelligence agencies, drawing on security figures, and then fading away after multiple scandals. Some of them are well known, some Reuters reports on US intelligence agents being recruited to hack for the Emiratis, that kind of thing. And then it sort of disappears as well. So these bureaucratic stories are really important in understanding the strategic benefit for interpreting cybersecurity in the way that it is in the cybercrime laws. What I want to do is just briefly go through the non sort of government-based aspect of this story as well, because I think it's one of the most original and interesting parts of the story as well. And this is because while, of course, legislation and government institutions are central to the co-optation of cybersecurity and the increase in authoritarian practices, it is also in combination with various private sector participants, not least the telecom sector that I mentioned at the start. And this has been noticed by several different observers, so ranging from, for example, Citizen Lab, an NGO that works a lot in this space, who have not only tried to analyze the spread of filtering and monitoring technologies by private companies, such as Procera. They also get hold of the boxes that they use to do this censorship and filtering that you see here, the deep packet inspection boxes, and they analyze them sort of technologically as well. And then it becomes a bigger deal, right? So, for example, you see as Gulf states get closer and closer to Israel, leading to the Abraham Accords, you have critical accounts of Israel's role in selling monitoring and filtering software to these states. And so beyond this clear growth of a private sector underpinning of censorship and surveillance in these states, in the book, I use conversations at conferences with people involved in this industry to see how they use their technological and expert position beyond the headlines, right? Not just that they were implementing surveillance, but also they were really doing it, thinking about not only the technologies they were using, but also the values behind cybersecurity as well, right? In practice, on the ground. What do I mean by that? Well, let's look at a hypothetical Gulf contract that a surveillance provider discussed with me in some detail, right? And I use hypothetical advisedly. He definitely said it was hypothetical. And he said, well, you know, for example, imagine in this hypothetical Gulf contract, he had been asked to build a search tool, right? An idea for looking at massive volumes of data and searching. He said, well, that's an easy way to do fishing expeditions, right? Ways for just looking for people that you know and just saying, well, have they shared this particular word, right? Or this piece of content, and then we can pick up everyone who's done that. And the provider said, well, no, let's not do that. Let's build it. So you have to enter a phone number. You have to know something about the person you want to gather data on, rather than just doing a dragnet of anyone who said anything about that, right? This is someone who's talking about how they technologically implemented monitoring and filtering. And he said, when I asked him in a little bit more detail, he said, well, we didn't tell the customer this is what we were doing, right? We said it was for performance reasons. And this is fascinating, right? This is a surveillance provider implementing a monitoring and surveillance solution, but introducing their own values, right? Saying, we actually don't think you should be able to do this. Right? This is not the kind of thing that we want you to be able to do. And so we're going to limit it technologically, and we're going to give you a performance reason why. Right? None of this kind of interaction at an expert level on the ground is captured in accounts of authoritarian surveillance, right? None of this exists, right? So this kind of contest and competition is really important, but it's absent from most discussions. And then they go a little bit further, right? And so this is the last point I want to end on. And so, you know, again, another example, right? Maybe a hypothetical example, right? This surveillance provider was working with a country where they were arresting people due to comments on social media, right? He says they were worried about this. The extent to which they were worried, we only have his word for it. But they knew the names of people that were being arrested. So they said, well, what can we do? And he sort of gave me a sort of strange look and said, well, could we be even sneakier, right? We have access to audit logs. And he proceeded to explain that what that meant was that they could look at how the customer, the state, had used this system and gone through it and said, well, maybe we can check whether the people who are being arrested, names were due to what their searches or the way that they had used the system that they had provided. Right? Again, these are cybersecurity solution providers, right? People working in the cybersecurity industry writ large, who are importing their own values, their own judgments on what shouldn't, who and who is not a threat into the very technologies that they are selling to these states, right? That is a moral maneuver, right? That is an idea that once we get behind this big shift, right? The big shift to cybersecurity as content crime, we then get into this micro practice detail of maneuvers by technical experts. So just to summarize, this chapter looks at moral maneuvers saying, well, looks at moral maneuvers saying it meets the scope conditions, right? Cybercrime and censorship are clearly both prominent and esoteric topics. They're high profile, but they're not necessarily easy to understand, right? There are strategic benefits to moral maneuvers here, right? You have bureaucratic competition between security and other parts of these governments. And a bit I didn't talk about, you have commercial competition in both telecoms and defense. And so the moral maneuver concept shows us that there are the alterations of value claims, right? What is a threat in cybersecurity? What objects should we protect? What things should we protect? Clearly there's a shift to content rather intrusion, but also clearly there's alteration of technical claims, right? Deep packet inspection is malleable depending on who's implementing it. And in the book, I took more about these ideas of network visibility, going from an organizational context to a broader national context, thinking about we should have national networks being visible to the state. And there are limits, right? And I talk a little bit about the geopolitical alliances and the overall political economy of this industry as putting limits on how far these alterations of value claims and technical claims can really go. And overall, the consequence is that you have a form of cybersecurity understood as a protection of a national information environment, right? This is significantly different to the other forms of cybersecurity that I examine in the book. And in each case, in each chapter, I trace how this one emerges through these expert divisions, contests, struggles. Hopefully, you've got an idea of how that speaks to these three questions of the theoretical conversations. I can go into that in more detail in the Q&A, but for now, I'll leave it there. The book goes into the politics of cybersecurity in the Middle East, tracing how it's emerged and evolved, and hopefully through that, learning how we can maybe see how it would, the course of the cybersecurity in the Middle East and elsewhere in the future. Thank you very much.